So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our friend Mike Ward at Clarivate to kick off our first discussion.
Welcome to this webinar, which coincides with Huntington's Disease Awareness Day. I'm Mike Ward, the Global Head of Life Sciences and Healthcare Thought Leadership at Clarivate, and I'm delighted to be hosting this opening fireside chat with Professor Michael Hayden, who is the most cited author in the field of Huntington's disease, and also has an impressive track record both in academia and in industry. Indeed, Michael is currently a Killam Professor of Medical Genetics at the University of British Columbia and the Canada Research Chair in Human Genetic and Molecular Medicine, and is the author of more than 900 publications and the recipient of many, many awards. Some of his work from his lab at UBC actually led to the development of the first approved gene therapy. And in addition to his academic work, he was president of global R&D and the chief scientific officer at Teva Pharmaceutical Industries. And that was between 2012 and 2017. And during that time, 35 drugs treating CNS diseases were approved, including one for Huntington's disease. Michael also is the co-founder of 5 biotech companies and is currently the CEO of Prelinia Therapeutics, as well as being a member of the board for a number of private and public biotechs. So consequently, Michael is very well placed to discuss both the challenges and opportunities associated with Huntington's disease. So Michael, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Michael, I mean, kick off almost like the big question. In your opinion, how would you describe the current state of research and development for effective treatments of Huntington's disease?
Well, I would say, the preclinical research is going ahead at an excellent pace. Identification of new targets and pathways, new approaches. But the field is still coming to terms with the disappointments that came out of the Roche and Wave trials that were just again publicly announced at the CHDI conference yesterday. This result showed that patients in the Roche trial who were on frequent therapy every 8 weeks actually did worse in progression than placebo. The patients on more infrequent treatment did the same as placebo. And in the Wave trial, again, there was disappointing news in that there was no target engagement and no knockdown of mutant Huntington, as one might have hoped. And also there were some serious adverse events in the high dose group in a significant number of patients. So all of this is a shock to the community, but it's important to note that the mechanism proposed, which is knockdown of mutant Huntington as a potential approach to treatment of Huntington disease, is still alive and well. We do not know exactly why, for example, the Roche trial failed. There are still many questions that we hope to be able to get answers to, and we will learn a lot from this particular trial. The questions are raised that are not answered yet include the Roche trial knocked down both the mutant, the cause of the disease, and the wild-type Huntington disease. Did knocking down wild-type Huntington disease have a greater effect in terms of losing some of the neuroprotection that may have come from knocking down mutants? Secondly, it appears there might have been an inflammatory process with white cells in the CSF And did this inflammatory process also have some impact, in particular in patients who are getting treated more frequently? Thirdly, this particular ASO did not knock down exon 1. And was the knockdown of exon 1 important for this? So all of these are questions that are to be answered. They will direct future therapeutic strategies. Wave has announced that they will go into another trial with another linked polymorphism, but with new chemistry. Some of the preclinical data in vivo does offer more hope. So there's tremendous amount to be learned from those studies. This is a disappointment for the community, but this is a resilient community, a community committed to the long term. It's a marathon, and we're only partly through that marathon. And by working together, we'll learn more to design new trials that are innovative in this way. And also there are numerous companies and trials behind, still focusing on knockdown, and we can talk about those in a moment.
Yeah, sure. I mean, actually, I mean, notwithstanding the sort of the disappointment of that trial that you described, what have you observed, or are you seeing that actually still makes you optimistic that we're going to be able to come up with treatments for Huntington's disease in the future?
Well, I'm optimistic, and I'm optimistic for the long term. I think you need to let many flowers bloom. Predicting success in clinical development is always very difficult. But I'm pleased to see that there are many initiatives focusing on different approaches to improving Huntington disease. Some are gene therapy, where you're actually looking to actually knock down Huntington in the area where it's most important, which is the caudate nucleus, the basal ganglia. Others are oral forms of therapy, which will give you the target engagement that you need. Finally, there are drugs now. There is a drug in late stage clinical development from Pralenia that's focusing on a totally different mechanism, an oral drug that reaches all parts of the brain and is focusing on increasing the activity of sigma-1 that has some compelling preclinical and early clinical data that gives one hope. So I would say the community, while disappointed, is resolute, determined to reach the goal. It may take a little longer, but the community is committed. And I would say when I talk about the community, I talk about scientists, I talk about clinicians, I talk about the families, the patient organizations, all together, because we are inextricably bound. We need the patients to participate in the trials, and the patients have come forward with amazing courage, dignity, and commitment. And we need the same from the scientists and the clinicians. And I would say the community as a whole is robust, healthy, and working together.
Yeah. I mean, sort of looking at that point, specifically for those, those scientists and those clinicians, what are the sort of the biggest challenges that that they face, and what are they doing to address them?
Well, the scientists and clinicians have worked close to the families for a long time, and I would say now, as part of clinical development, the involvement of family representatives is very crucial. Working with the lay organizations, be it the European Huntington Disease Network, which essentially represents patients and scientists all together, the Huntington Disease Society of America, the Huntington Society of Canada, together with lay organizations throughout, is very important. From a structural point of view, in terms of clinical development, we are also, most trials now are having patients as part of the steering committee, family members, and also some are having family advisory groups that are also advising the delineation of endpoints. So this working together, it's tremendously humbling and mutually learning. As scientists and clinicians, we don't always know what matters most to patients. We've learned, for example, from patients that stopping the progression of the illness, allowing them to maintain function, even for a short while, is most important. Allowing them to continue their activities of daily living, continue working, continue managing finances, continually hugging their children and grandchildren, going on trips together. So maintaining function is an area that's of most concern. And this is the area that most companies are now focusing on, which is maintaining function. The good news is there's also been evolution on the regulatory side, because we can't get drugs to patients. We work, again, in deep partnership with the regulatory authorities, both in the United States at the FDA and Europe, the EMA, and various country regulatory authorities. And they too, over the last few years, have recognized that maintaining function is most important for patients. And so they've allowed, for the first time over the last few years, functional capacity or ability to maintain function as measured by different endpoints as a single primary endpoint in clinical trials. They've understood the meaningfulness, significance of this particular approach. And the one measure that's used is TFC, total functional capacity. This is a measure that's been around a long time, discovered by Scholson and Fahn in the late 70s. It's been used in many clinical trials in the past, and now is a recognized endpoint for the FDA, also included with EMA as a single meaningful endpoint. Sadly, there's been no drug except one that has had impact on TFC in any study or in any analysis. When we think about drugs for the CNS, ideally, if one had a choice, you'd like an oral drug that can have target engagement that's very soluble to get across the blood-brain barrier and get to numerous parts of the brain, because in the end, Huntington disease is a diffuse brain disease. It starts selectively in the basal ganglia, but as the disease progresses, it affects most regions of the brain. And ideally, you want a drug that reaches there. Alternatively, you could develop and provide a way to deliver a drug either into the ventricles or into the basal ganglia, or potentially intrathecally, that gets diffusion and involves the full brain, but that's more difficult and constitutes additional challenges.
Yeah. So I'd just like to focus a little bit more on that patient voice. You sort of mentioned, how listening to the patient has sort of shaped sort of the development of meaningful endpoints, not just sort of clinical endpoints. Could you sort of describe what it actually looks like? Sort of at your company, you sort of said you've listened to patients. How do patients interact on a sort of a day-to-day or a month-to-month basis with you and your colleagues?
Well, my history is that I first saw patients with Huntington disease more than 40 years ago in South Africa as a medical student intern. And in those days, you did home visits. And so I learned to visit these patients, often disenfranchised by their disease, but I was moved by their courage, their dignity, the respect and warmth. And that had a lasting impact on me and still motivates and inspires me personally. Since then, I've been deeply involved with patient organizations. There are many ways you can interact. At our lab in Vancouver, we have patient tours where they come and visit the lab and understand what we're doing, and we have opportunities. There are patient camps where you interact with patients. We founded the first Huntington disease camp really in the mid-80s in Canada, and these camps are seen both throughout Canada now and also throughout the world. So there are many ways that you learn. you learn that these are patients that are often disabled, but they are perceptive, they feel, they really have lots to offer, and their courage and their commitment to do whatever is needed to hasten and improve the field is profound. Then it translates into more specific activities. As part of this, in trials, these patient advisory groups are there first to discuss what are the endpoints that matter most to patients. And I think there's an alignment that if we could have some way to delay progression, that has the most impact for patients in terms of the quality of their lives. And so you work with a patient advisory group. And then in addition, patients on a steering committee or family members that play a key role. And it's most important that we also recognize that there are families and patients with Huntington disease, not just in North America and Europe, but all over the world. In many disenfranchised countries where facilities are much less significant, there's less support. And as part of this, we also need to think about how, when we finally get a drug approved, we can have access to these drugs globally. So patients can be afforded the benefits of participating in science and research, but that those benefits are distributed around the world in ways that these other countries can also benefit. So it is a global perspective. It's a global perspective that is significant in terms of working with families. You know, this is a serious disease. It has been described as one of the most disastrous diseases. And it's disastrous because there are 100,000 patients in the world who are affected with Huntington disease. But for every one patient, maybe 3 people who carry the gene who are destined to be ill but not yet ill. This is a large number of patients. And sometimes when you think about treating patients, you may need to treat patients before they get symptoms. So at the moment, all the trials are focusing primarily on secondary prevention, patients who have the disease and now you want to slow progression. But ideally, in a protective way, thinking about neuroprotection, you'd want to focus even earlier so you can treat patients before they've lost too many cells and hopefully maintain and stabilize their function. So it's a global issue. It's a disease that has no treatment now that alters progression. And sadly, when you are burying your mother or your father, you have some insights into potentially your own future. So it's in perpetuity in families. And that's what the cycle of hope that we're trying to provide, and the cycle of despair to break this cloud that threatens these families, in effort to bring them hope, bring them optimism, but we do this together with them as they volunteer to participate in trials, often where outcomes are not known, such as in the Roche trial, but the patients are resolute, and their dignity and determination, commitment is very deeply inspiring for me.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, an area that sort of 10 years, 20 years ago was sort of potentially bleak for a lot of patients was in the area of cancer. But in the sort of certainly in the last decade, with the sort of the advent of immuno-oncology, we've seen sort of rapid advances in the treatment of cancer. I'm just wondering whether there are any lessons from what was achieved there that can help in the sort of development treatment of diseases of the brain.
Yeah, well, that's a really important question. And I would say there's lots that we can learn from cancer. Firstly, understanding basic mechanisms and understanding pathways and targets has led to novel approaches in immuno-oncology that is really dramatically changing the outcome. So firstly, understanding the basic biology is very important. Secondly, it takes a long time. Immuno-oncology took a while and now is in its really flourishing. Thirdly, the opportunity for combination therapy. In cancer, we recognize that combination therapy is now the rule, not the exception. And certainly in Huntington disease, combination therapy is likely to hit multiple pathways in an effort to have impact on this disease. And so we will be looking there are platform trials that happened in cancer where placebo was shared. These were managed across multiple arms with placebo shared, the treatment arm going into a therapy, as is going on, for example, in ALS. There's the first platform trial now, 4 arms, placebo shared across 4, so you recruit only less a placebo per arm, accelerates recruitment, gets you answers earlier. So I would say there's lots to be learned from other diseases, and they bring us hope that in the end we will be able to have impact on some of these terrible outcomes that occur with this disease.
Earlier on, you also mentioned about the fact that there's lots of different sort of people involved in the the development of new treatments. It requires cross collaboration with in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw academic researchers, we saw biotechs, we saw pharmaceutical companies, we saw regulators all come together with this clear focus of finding something to treat and control the pandemic. And I'm just again wondering, are there lessons from just the speed that everything was done? Are there lessons that again the neuroscience community could learn from that?
Well, I take a lot of hope from what happened in the COVID during this period in terms of learnings. Firstly, the regulatory authorities were very responsive to the urgent unmet need and came up with, for example, emergency authorization. So there was a bar that looked at efficacy, but the bar didn't need the kind of rigor that's always needed because the need was so great. I would think that we will continue to see increased flexibility from the regulatory authorities in terms of hastening potential approval of drugs that truly do demonstrate significant benefit in the interest of patients. That's certainly on the regulatory side. On the patient side and the novel ways of measuring outcomes, we looked at patients who were restricted by virtue of COVID. We looked at other methods to look at outcomes by phone, by video, and the virtual approach to also looking at outcomes for which we're learning more about is also another way that we believe that even in the face of pandemic, the recruitment in trials does not have to be necessarily curtailed or stopped. Then I would say, thirdly, the interaction amongst the community. What we saw was one company doing the manufacturing, another company doing the basic science. We saw the interaction between biotech and pharma, and between pharma and pharma in terms of manufacturing. And this was also profound. We also saw rapid development. I'm particularly aware of, for example, in antibody and monoclonal antibody therapy, we went from a patient with is recovering from COVID to an antibody in clinical development in 3 months, something that would normally take 3 to 4 years. The unmet need was profound. Well, I would say in this particular disease, the unmet need is also so profound. It's not that patients are suffering, the clouds hang over them, and we also, hopefully there will be an approach that sees also these non-communicable diseases as urgent and needing immediate response with flexibility and speed across all regulatory authorities, mirrored by a collaboration between biotech and pharma and the families around the world. So I'm looking forward to a new era of cooperation and collaboration. It's already there in this field, but I think it can be further enhanced.
All right. So we're almost out of time. So I just thought, in summing up, whether you could share, what are the key milestones that we should all be looking for, particularly in the near future, that will actually confirm that progress is being made in the field of Huntington's disease?
Well, I would say we need to learn significantly from the trials that failed. But when there is failure, the challenge, there will be failure, but the challenge is how we respond to it, how we pick ourselves up, how we learn deeply and design different trials that give us the opportunity to learn and overcome those obstacles. We will monitor progress. There are numerous other drugs that are in development. We should monitor the translation of these into the clinic, the recruitment, the outcomes. Prolenia has a drug in phase 3 development that is recruiting very well against a different target, an oral drug. And we look forward to finishing recruitment and being able to see results from that particular study. But this is just one of many. There are early approaches to the science that are illuminating new approaches to knockdown, including oral drugs, new approaches to dealing with some of the issues, which are delivery, knockdown of the exon 1, and also improving the safety and tolerability of these drugs that offer a lot of hope. And then there are just numerous other targets. In the end, we'll probably need combination therapy. And so maintaining a very cooperative, collaborative culture will be very important for this community. And then I would say gauging the commitment and continuing to respectfully engage with the patient community, keeping them close. As I started, we are inextricably bound. Our fate is together, and maintaining that respectful togetherness as we move forward will also be key as we pursue new avenues and new opportunities for bringing some hope and optimism and some relief for the patients in these families.
So, Michael, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us today. I mean, the work you're doing is very important both to patients and the people who care for them. And I'm sure that after hearing what you've actually had to say, they will all be more optimistic and will be in a better place we'll all be in a better place to treat Huntington's. So on behalf of our virtual audience, I'd like to thank you very much.
What a pleasure to talk to you, Mike. Thank you so much.